Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy. It's one of my personal training goals for this year to try to better understand the two-handed sword section of Giacomo di Grassi's treatise and to develop and improve my skills in this area of my own fencing. And for that reason, I thought I'd do a kind of introductory video today to talk about two-handed swords in the Italian fencing tradition. Okay, so let's just briefly talk about the Italian fencing tradition in general and how it relates to two-handed swords. Single-handed swords were always more popular and more common than two-handed swords. There's no doubt about it. So two-handers were much more specialized pieces of kit used for particular purposes in combat. That being said, two-handers are reasonably well represented across quite a wide range of time within the Italian fencing tradition. So the earliest treatise that talks about them is that of Fiore de' Liberi from the very start of the 15th century. And the latest treatise to mention them that I know of is that of Colombani in the early 1700s, believe it or not. I think it's around about 1720. So we've got this period of basically 300 years where two-handed swords were in use in fencing styles in Italy. But of course, their peak usage was, I would say, from the mid-15th to the mid-17th century. So that's really the main focus for fencing applications. So what I'll do in this video is break the history of two-handed swords down into three eras. We'll talk about the late medieval era, and then the early Renaissance era, and finally the late Renaissance era. So let's go through them one by one. Firstly then, the late medieval era. So this basically means from the, let's say, the very end of the 14th century up until the very end of the 15th century. So this is the time of Fiore de' Liberi and Filippo Vadi. So the typical Italian two-handed swords of this period had a blade length of approximately 100 centimeters, give or take a few centimeters. They had a weight of anywhere from 1.5 to 1.8 kilograms, and the grip of the sword was usually 2 handspans long, and the hands were protected by a simple crossguard style hilt. The blades themselves had a wide variety of cross-section and overall design. Some of them were very flat and broad, some of them were a lot more tapering and thrust-oriented, and there were plenty of swords in the middle as well. So these weapons in the original treatises were referred to with the term spada a due mani, so the two-handed sword. Later fencing masters of the 16th century retrospectively referred to these medieval weapons as the spada a mano e mezzo, which is a hand and a half sword. So that's quite a useful term just to distinguish them from the bigger swords which followed. Speaking of which, let's move on to the Renaissance. So the early Renaissance era, for our purposes, can be thought of as extending from 1500 to around 1550 or 1560. So the two-handed swords of this period are a bit bigger than their medieval cousins. So blade lengths were more like 110 to 115 centimeters. And the grips were further extended as well, being more or less 3 handspans long on average. Most of the swords at this time still had simple cross guards, although usually proportionally bigger. Many of the blades were also fitted with these little triangular lugs at the ricasso, or the lower section of the blade. And these could aid in parrying, binding, and similar maneuvers when interacting with the opponent's weapon. So this is basically the sword which was typical of Achille Marozzo, most famously, the Anonimo Bolognese treatise almost certainly referred to this type of weapon, and most likely Pietro Monte was using something along the lines of this sword as well. All of these treatises use the term spada a due mani, so quite simply the two-handed sword, to describe the weapon that they are using. Let's now move on to the final period and examine how this differs from the final form of the two-hander in Italy. Okay, so I'm defining the late Renaissance as beginning at around about 1550, 1560, and extending on into the 17th century. And in fact, this design of sword, which I'm going to describe to you just now, was used throughout the rest of the lifetime of the two-hander in Italy. So there were no further evolutions after this point. So, the sword in this period grew even bigger again, so blades were now typically from 115 to 120 centimeters long. The grips were specified, by De Grassi at least, as being 4 handspans long. The guards of the weapons could be more complex here. They often included side rings to further protect the sword hands. And of course, the triangular lugs were present on many of the swords of this period. I should note, however, that there were also plenty of swords matching these larger specifications, but without the lugs and sometimes also without side rings. And we can see this type of weapon illustrated in Francesco Alfieri's book of the 1640s. So this really big sword weighed more like 2.5 to 3 kilograms, with an average weight of historical originals being about 2.6 to 2.7 kilograms. The treatises of this era mostly use the term spadone to describe the weapon, which would literally translate to great sword. So that basically gives us a medieval weapon called a hand-and-a-half sword, weighing something like a little over 1.5 kilograms with a blade length of 100 centimeters. An early Renaissance two-handed sword weighing more like 2 kilograms with a blade length of, let's say, around 115 centimeters or a little less. And then a late Renaissance greatsword with a blade length of 115 to 120 centimeters, weighing over 2.5 kilograms. So these are really the 3 subcategories of two-hander within the Italian fencing tradition. Okay, so I wanted to finish today's video with a bit of a wide-angle shot so you can see 2 of my training weapons here and appreciate the difference in scale between them. So this is my training sword for medieval stuff. So this is a hand-and-a-half sword, technically speaking. And this one is, of course, a synthetic trainer following the specifications for a spadone or greatsword. So you can see there is a significant difference in size between the 2 weapons. Unfortunately, I don't have training sword for the intervening stage, the Marozzo style spada a due mani, but hopefully you can imagine it is pretty much halfway in between these 2 weapons. So there you go, that is an overview of two-handed swords within the Italian fencing tradition. As always, I hope that was interesting and useful for you. And I will finish there for today. Take care everyone, see you again soon, bye.